Several years of balancing a game development day job with the demands of trying to run an indie startup had left me a bit burned out. I wasn't finding any joy in the work anymore, and beyond that, I was finding it almost impossible to get any work done. A friend suggested it was probably time to dump all the old baggage, put all the old projects on a shelf, and just start over. This sounded like a good idea, but I didn't quite know where to start. I didn't want to resurrect an old unfinished project or simply start a new version of one of those. I also needed to pick something that wouldn't take too long. Something that I could make playable within a short period of time and move on from. Something I had no intention to try and ship commercially. In the end, the thing that seemed most fun was slot cars. Truthfully, I have tried this before, but it was well over a decade ago, and if we're being honest, closer to 2. I had no idea what I was doing, it went nowhere, and in the end, I think became bowling. I thought it might be fun to try this again with a bit of knowledge and experience. My first attempt was a kinematic solution. I grabbed the Curvy plugin from the Unity Asset Store and used it to extrude a road along a spline path. Using one of the built-in game controllers that comes with Curvy, I set a guide pin for the car to follow the spline around the track, with a slight offset to put the vehicle in its correct lane. I added mesh colliders to the tires and used hinge joints to create front and rear axles. The guide pin and car were connected with another hinge joint near the front axle. This was super quick to get set up and worked pretty well. It wasn't quite right though. The car was dragged around like a rag doll instead of being pushed by its own power, and you could tell watching. The controls seemed wrong, and it never felt like a real slot car. At this point, I knew I'd have to roll up my sleeves and get into the physics engine if I wanted it to be right. I modeled a slot into the road geometry and its collider, then added a cylinder with a mesh collider to the vehicle to use as a guide pin. I added a motor to the hinge joints that served as the axles and attempted to use the existing mesh colliders as tires to drive the car. This rig rolled downhill well enough, but made a poor motor. It was time to break out the wheel colliders, and immediately things got worse. After a lot of tweaks to the rig, it started to get drivable, but there was still a long way to go and a short time to get there. Enter Eddie's vehicle physics. If you're going to be working with cars in Unity, this is a really useful plugin and does most of the heavy lifting for you. I scaled up my geometry to match the size of the vehicle in the Eddie's plugin, transferred the rig over to the vehicle I've been using, dropped it on the road, and immediately knew I was on the right track. There were still issues to sort out and a lot of physics settings to fine-tune. Real slot cars are usually 1/32nd or 1/24th scale. I didn't want to have to work at that small a scale though, and settled on 1/4. The first issue that needed to be solved was the wheels kept getting stuck in the slot. The solution was 2 sets of colliders, a top road collider that was perfectly flat. The car and tires would collide with this, but the guide pin wouldn't. And then a second collider which still had the slot, and only the guide pin would collide with this layer. The next issue was the guide pin getting stuck. This would seemingly happen at random and resulted in the car stuttering or just jumping the track. Returning to an idea from my first rig, I reintroduced the hinge joint that attached the guide pin to the car. I also made the guide pin and slot much bigger and elongated the pin so it was more of an oval. This extra wiggle room seemed to be just what the car needed, and it did help it get around the corners much better. And since I had already separated the visual geometry from the colliders, I could have as large of a slot as I wanted while maintaining the small visual one the player sees. At this point, everything seemed to be working fine until I added a hill and tried to go up it. After digging around, I discovered that at some point I had set rotational constraints on the rigid body for the guide pin. This gave a false sense of stability while driving on a flat track and meant back to the drawing board for the physics settings. I eventually got it smoothed back out though. There still seemed to be an issue with too much vibration and jumping out of the track at high speeds. I realized that with no frame of reference other than the track and the oddly scaled plywood texture, it was impossible to have a true sense of how quickly you were moving. I thought I should find this out, so I added a speedometer. It turns out the car is stable to about 180 kilometers per hour. Down the road, I'll likely revisit the physics settings, but for now I think they're pretty good, and most of the issues I'm having are due to inconsistencies in the track itself. So now my next steps are: spend more time developing a track, make it a decent course for racing on, and make sure there are no inconsistencies that cause the car to crash. Add some stand-in props and scenery to have more of a sense of what speed we're moving at, and some more game-type functions like lap counters and timers. And at some point, I'll be back to let you know how that all works out.